Hello, and welcome to a special edition of Up Close on METV. I'm Charles Clapsaddle, station manager for Manatee Educational Television. And on this special edition of Up Close, we're going to look at a problem that has been an ongoing situation here in Manatee County for many years: homeless children. And joining us today is Deb Bailey, the program manager for Project Heart. Deb, thank you so much for joining us today. As I mentioned, homeless children is indeed a problem. It's something that tugs at your heartstrings, and is something that one would think doesn't really exist. But here in Manatee County, it really does.
I think you made a good point about people thinking that it doesn't exist. The children are invisible. They're not the guys out on the street corner holding a sign saying, homeless, hungry, God bless. More often than not, they find themselves in situations that we call doubled up, so they're staying somewhere. The numbers right now are alarming. As of today, I received my count from the district in the data information system. We have 1,109 children who have been identified as being homeless at some point this school year, currently enrolled in school. Now,
let me just ask you, that's over 1,000 children that have no permanent address.
Well, not all simultaneously. That's where it gets a little confusing. The way we track our data is cumulative through the school year. So that 1,109 is children who were homeless at some point this school year, because their eligibility for rights and resources carries for the whole school year.
I see. But still an alarming number. When you talk 1,000 people at some point during the school year, these children have no permanent abode.
That's correct. And then when you add the younger siblings who are not yet school age, it jumps up about 1,350 so far. Last year, our numbers were 1,649 students and 1,911 children altogether that we identified that meet a specific definition of homelessness.
So last year, the number kind of spiked up to almost 2,000 children that were homeless, were considered homeless.
It wasn't necessarily a spike. We've seen some trends over time. We've been tracking that data since 2003. Back in 2003, we identified 943 children. The big spike was when we had the local hurricanes, and we identified 2,415 students that year.
My goodness.
Yeah, then it dropped down after that. We didn't get a big influx with Katrina. Most of the people who could make it this far were fairly functional. And then we had a little dip in the numbers when the immigration crackdown started to take place, and migrant workers weren't coming forward and identifying themselves. And quite a large number of our migrant families also met that definition of homelessness. So even though our overall count for homeless remained constant, it really didn't reflect that. The bottom had just dropped out of the migrant count. So it should have, actually been higher with the economic downturn. I think we're going to see a slight dip in our numbers this year. The economy seems to be showing just that slightest uptick, so hopefully we'll have a little fewer numbers. But part of the change in our numbers too is that we've been around longer. We are getting the word out into the community through opportunities like this, so people are much more likely to be identified. And they don't see themselves as homeless. They don't
let's wait and let's identify and define what is considered homeless. I mean, is it, it's, as you mentioned, it's not the guy out on the street, the people living in the parks or panhandling. Homelessness has some very specific and definitive definitions. And tell us how you rate those.
Well, in our program, we go by, it was originally in the McKinney-Vento Act, but that also applies to non-education. Now in the school system, it's called Title X. It's actually a title. And there's a very specific definition. The overall umbrella is that you lack fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime housing. So what does that mean? Fixed means that your residence is anchored to the ground. You're not living in a tent or a travel trailer or a car. Regular means that you can stay there on a regular basis, and it's also a place that's regularly meant for human habitation, so you're not staying in someone's garage or a barn or a garden shed or something like that. And then finally is adequate. Is this abode considered adequate by your community standards for privacy or personal safety and things like that.
Electricity or plumbing or any of those things.
In some communities, there may be many families that lack indoor plumbing, so the lack of indoor plumbing is not necessarily considered inadequate in that community, like Appalachia or something, for example. But here in Manatee County, if we had someone who was in a residence that did not have indoor plumbing, then that would be considered inadequate. But the biggest part of inadequate that we see is the overcrowding. So that's where we count a lot of our families. So digging down deeper into that definition, obviously people who are in shelters, and we do have a handful of shelters in Manatee County. Unfortunately, the only family shelter right now is the Salvation Army, and they only have 6 units for moms and kids. So with the numbers I mentioned, there's obviously a gap in coverage. There should be a new facility opening that will house 50 children and families. So
where's that supposed to be?
That's supposed to be at the old DCF office. The gentleman apparently who owned that property has donated it for a tax write-off, and Lee Martin, who's very well connected with the Homeless Coalition, is spearheading that effort.
Very dedicated individual.
We're really looking forward to that facility opening.
Well, and that's a key part as we discuss the definition of homelessness, is that whether it's economic downturn or whatever, there's not that much affordable housing available in an inventory to absorb these kind of numbers. Is that correct?
Well, a lot of our families are just the very low income families, a lack of education and job skills, so they do have difficulty finding affordable housing. So that's when they may fall into the next definition, is where that we consider them doubled up. They are a guest in the housing of someone else on a temporary basis, and it's generally not adequate. So for example, if I lost my job or they cut my hours at work and I can't pay my rent, I may go live with my sister or my mother or one of my friends. But now it's also overcrowded, so it's temporary and it's overcrowded until I can find a place that I can afford, which is going to be the challenge when you look at what the housing wage should be for Manatee County compared to what the rents cost. It's just unaffordable for too many of our citizens.
There's a real disparity between those.
Yeah, there's a great website for that, the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and you can look at any metropolitan area in the country. You can look at your state, you can look at your specific county and see what the incomes are and what the fair market value for rent is and what the living wage is required to afford housing in that community. And when you look at Manatee County in Florida, it's very distressing. We do have a severe shortage of affordable housing, especially for those very low income families.
The very low income families specifically. Now, when we talk about homeless children, we're talking all ages. We're talking from very young, high school age, and everything in between. So have you found that these children that are in there, they're facing a unique set of circumstances. Through no fault of their own, they found themselves either in a shelter or doubled up, as you said. How does this impact? And no one is more well-versed in this to give us insight into this situation than you, Deb. We've heard you speak on numerous occasions, and not only you're tremendously well-informed and knowledgeable, but you have a passion for these students and young people to try to do the best that you can. But the one thing, as a child, you look for stability. You look for some kind of, ongoing relationship, family and friends and home and school and stuff. But a homeless child is in a different set of circumstances. Can you tell us about some of the impact that this has on children? I
think it's a very serious impact, and a lot of the trend in the mental health arena is to look at what they call trauma-informed care. And there is a recognition that children in homeless situations or with this high amount of mobility moving from place to place are experiencing trauma. And there's even research that shows that childhood trauma can have a lifetime effect on your physical well-being and health conditions. So it's a very serious problem. And then when we look at the parents, some studies that were done locally several years ago, a lot of the homeless moms had been physically and or sexually abused as children and or as adults and had issues with mental health and or substance abuse. So we have a lot of people who are suffering not just the acute crisis of homelessness, but a lifetime of trauma. And then when you look at the individual
mental, physical,
emotional, and that childhood trauma has lifelong impact, intellectually, medically, all different ways. And for little kids, you know, trying to be successful in school, the stress of not knowing where am I going to be tonight, you know, and they'll overhear their parents talking, well, we're getting evicted, where are we going to go? I don't know how we're going to pay the rent, all these things. And children start to worry about things that maybe they shouldn't have to. And then it becomes very difficult for them to concentrate in school. If they're overcrowded, they may not get a good night's sleep because there are too many people in the home, or they don't even have a bed. They're sleeping on the floor. The transportation issues to keep them in the same school all year become problematic. You do sometimes get more health issues. There's hunger quite often. So you're looking at those types of issues having a severe negative impact on the child's education. That's why it's so important for them to stay in that same school while the family's in transition and highly mobile. At least they can have that stability and predictability of the familiar classroom setting.
And I would think that's, you know, a very important key to, you know, to a child's well-being. Can you give us an understanding of what the average length of that you're seeing for homeless children? Is it 6 months? Is it a year? Is it longer than a year? You know, what's that average time of homelessness, specifically with the children that you deal with?
Well, it varies a lot depending on the parent's initial ability to be self-sufficient. So if you have parents who have multiple impairments, cognitive or psychological, or lack of education, job skills, no car, bad credit, eviction record, you know, criminal record, whatever. Those
alcohol, drug abuse,
all those things that might happen, lack of affordable child care, you know, lack of decent public transportation. All of those, the more factors you have, then the longer it is going to take that person to reach any level of self-sufficiency. So if a person was relatively high functioning, they hit a temporary glitch, it may be a matter of, you know, 3, 6, 8, maybe 9 months till they get a new job and get back on their feet. But families can be in these situations I've had for multiple school years, and they sometimes transition between different types of homelessness too. So we can have a family that was doubled up, they got evicted, they went into a motel until they could get into the shelter, then they get in the shelter, then they, you know, and back and forth, or on and off over the years. We're able to actually track which years individual students were identified, and we can look back and see, well, they were identified, you know, 2 or 3 years in a row, then there was a gap for a year or two, and now they're back again because of all those issues related to the chronic poverty, lack of affordable housing. So to say that there's an average, but I think it's longer than what people had expected. I know the Salvation Army lengthened their stay in the shelter because they recognized it was going to take the moms a lot longer than just, you know, a matter of weeks to be able to
become more self-reliant.
Exactly, to get the time to get your education up to where it needed to be, to build up some savings, to maybe purchase a car. All those things that are going to lead to real independence and real life change take time. So, you know, the kids can be for multiple school years still experiencing, or like I said, going between different homeless scenarios.
Now, you're responsible, among your responsibilities that you have, is to ensure that children get to school, and you know, that education is there and is available for them. And that's a critical thing. I mean, because school adds a great deal of stability, you know, to a young person under these circumstances. But homeless children have other rights and awarded to them. Can you tell us a little bit about those and what families can expect?
Well, first of all, I'd like to elaborate on the rest of the definition so we know who all
absolutely.
these rights
Go
apply
right ahead.
to.
Please do.
So we have the children in shelter and doubled up situations, and we also obviously have the hotels and motels, and I did mention campgrounds and vehicles, but you also have a little category of students who are awaiting placement in foster care. So that means either that they were in the shelter or they were in a temporary type of foster home. For example, if 3 children were removed from their home, but they couldn't find a foster home for all 3 of them together, they would be temporarily placed, and so they are actually awaiting their true foster home placement.
And that's considered its own.
That awaiting placement in foster care also falls under Title X, the McKinney-Vento Act, Project Heart Services. So any student who has met that definition is entitled to immediate enrollment. So let's say, for example, I had a fire and I had to go stay with my sister, and it was, you know, far enough away that we weren't going to try to stay in the same school. But now I don't have my birth certificate, shot records, physicals, you know, any of this identifying. I don't have proof of address at her address. I have nothing. So these students need to be immediately enrolled. That's a #1 protection under McKinney-Vento Act. And we can do a lot to assist them in obtaining those records and documents as needed. And then if they become homeless during the school year, they have the right to stay in that same school, what we call the school of origin. That's the school they were in before their housing situation changed, for the remainder of that school year. They are also entitled to transportation for the duration of their homelessness. So let's say, for example, I had a fire and I had to go stay with my sister-in-law. So now I'm doubled up. So my kids are entitled to transportation to that school of origin
from
wherever I may live now, and even cross county lines. And if you're on a state line, this is national federal law. So even if you're across state lines, we have to coordinate with neighboring districts. So it doesn't matter if it's Palmetto to South Bradenton. They have that right for transportation for the duration of the homelessness. Now, let's say I've been with my sister, mom, whatever, for a while, and now I'm getting my own place. My student still has the right to stay in that same school for the remainder of the school year that I obtain the housing, but the transportation is not mandated by federal law anymore. There's a little gap there between. And so in our district, we can see if there's a school bus available to keep that child in the same school. But the parent has that right no matter what. Unfortunately, without the transportation assistance, they can't always take advantage of the right. And I know that our national organizations are working hard, lobbying in Congress to try to maybe make those two definitions line up. You have the right to stay in the same school even if you get permanent housing. You have the right to get transportation, not just while you're homeless, so that we can truly keep these kids in the same school.
And I think that's very important. It seems to me that it's the same intent. It just stops someplace.
Well, the problem is it's an unfunded mandate, too.
Yeah, well, there's plenty of those to go around,
right,
isn't there?
So that makes it difficult, you know, and transportation is a very costly expenditure for any district. So,
and I think, you know, that's a key issue if you're a homeless family. If you can't get, you know, back and forth, you know, to a job or to a school, then you're at a loss. You have to rely upon other things to do things. So transportation is critical. But one of the things that, you know, comes to mind, Deb, and, you know, please elaborate, is, you know, because your insight is just invaluable, is that when you interview with a homeless child and family, and you're sitting down with them, do you outline, you and your staff, do you outline for them all of their options and say, we know this is a terrible predicament that you're in, but here's what we have that's available within the district and other entities to help?
Yeah, that's exactly the way our intake process works. When they're identified at the school, they show up on our monthly report, and we send them a notice of rights that lists that definition and then lists all the variety of our services. And right on the front page are your rights and resources, your rights to stay in the same school and be immediately enrolled. But if our initial contact is with a phone call, then we will elaborate that over the phone. Okay, so you know, you're in a motel now. We can put in a request for transportation in the meantime. Do you have a way to get the child to school? We can reimburse you for gas or give you bus passes until we can get a school bus set up. Do they need any school supplies or uniforms or any materials for classwork, whether it's science projects or anything like that? And
that falls under Project HARD.
We provide those services. School uniforms are a very big problem for a lot of families. We have over 24 schools that have mandatory uniforms. So when you have multiple children, that gets to be costly. So we'll see if they need uniforms or school supplies. One of the big needs, too, is unmet health needs.
I can imagine.
Yeah. For some kids, for example, very common is glasses. They're on Medicaid because it's a low income, but they broke or lost their glasses, and Medicaid will only replace them at certain intervals. And they don't really qualify for Lions Club because Lions Club wants to serve kids who don't have insurance. Right. So we can assist them with getting new glasses, or when people move to Florida from another state or even from another county and they need to transfer their Medicaid, there might be a gap in prescription coverage, whether that's for asthma, attention deficit disorder, diabetes supplies, EpiPens for allergic reaction. So those types of emergency medical needs, and then head lice treatment products. Kids can miss time because the parents can't afford the treatment. It's quite costly. So we do a lot with meeting educational needs. Field trips are really big. A lot of times, you know, families just don't have that money for the field trips. Right. Big ones are fifth grade field trips. A lot of the schools go on some really nice special trips that are educational and fun to close out their elementary school career.
Cultural,
right.
You know,
$70, $75, $80, $100, $120. Our families don't have that. So we have a very generous donor just sent us a check for $3,000 to cover field trips to make sure that our kids can fully participate. and get to be involved in those. And there's a different set of needs when you start looking at your secondary students, your high school students. More often they will be what we call unaccompanied youth. So they're not only homeless, but they're not with their parent or anybody who has any legal guardianship over them.
So they're on their own?
Yes, at much too young an age, obviously, in high school. And they might be staying with friends. There's a term, couch surfing, you know, staying place to place, or someone, you know, I went to go live with grandma. And sometimes it's because the kids are so healthy that they realize home is really a toxic place, or that parents are just unable to take care of them
for whatever
reason. Or unfortunately, sometimes, you know, day after the 18th birthday, out you go, whether you're still in high school or not. So
so that young person, that, you know, teenager is out there with no kind of parental supervision, no kind of parental guidance, and they're looking for some kind of stability in their life, and, you know, and all of the uncomfortable situations that can befall someone, they're more prey to.
Exactly.
One of the things, and I just want to briefly touch on it, because I think it's really a wonderful thing, is that you mentioned a donor, you know, donating so people can go on the field trips. You know, community support, to me, would seem to be like a vital thing for this program. Can you tell us a little bit about your outreach to the community and trying to see how they perhaps can help these children? We
have tremendous support in this community. And again, I think that's come from just being in existence for so long, and news press coverage, activities like this where we're publicizing the issues and the needs. When people realize the extent of the problem, they do step forward. So multiple churches provide assistance, quite a few civic groups, and then just individual and private donors. In fact, I've had to make a spreadsheet. It's one of the things that's required in my grant application to show that we're marketing and disseminating the program. That
actively looking
right, and that we're coordinating and collaborating not only with departments within the school district, but with agencies in the community that serve the homeless, and then in-kind and monetary and volunteer donations from the community. So we have to show that in order to benefit our students, we're doing all that. And we have had a lot of really wonderful support from, right now at Christmas time, you know, one church just adopted 40 students of ours. Another private donor provided gift cards. And these are for families that were too late to apply for Salvation Army or adopt a family or something like that.
But what a wonderful thing for this community to outreach, and especially during a holiday season when things are hectic and everything, to have organizations and businesses and churches outreach to you to say, well, you know, what can we do to help?
Exactly. They'll call and they'll say, we want to do something.
And you can always use other donors as well. If they wanted to find out of an organization or a business, or wanted to find out how possibly they could help, how could they do that? Do they contact you directly?
Sure. And I'd be happy to, you know, talk about our program, what the current needs are, the greatest unmet needs, some needs that are being met, the different types of funding that we get for those needs. We were talking a little bit about the older students and the challenges for being a teenager on your own. The academic rigor in high school, it just keeps intensifying every year. What students are expected to know, what classes they're expected to pass to graduate, above and beyond FCAT and, you know, a decent grade point average. So when you have students who, more likely, this being homeless, unaccompanied youth at 15 or 16 is not the first crisis and trauma in their life. More often than not, it's part of
ongoing.
It's part of a trend that they've experienced.
Exactly.
And they don't have that parental support, and they have these extra challenges. How do I get to school? I'm hungry. Where am I going to stay? I don't have money.
How do I get home?
How do I get home? You know, I'd like to play football, but I don't have the money. Or, you know, I want to be in JROTC, but I don't have the funding for the dry cleaning of the uniform. Gee, I want to walk in my graduation, but I can't afford the senior dues. I can't afford cap and gown. You know, so for me, when you look at these high school students who are coming out of these horrifying sometimes situations, the fact that they managed to graduate is a minor miracle. And we want to provide all the support that we can for them. And actually the high school students have some extra advantages when it comes to higher education. If they are unaccompanied, and we certify that when they apply for financial aid, they apply as an independent student. They don't have to have all the parental documentation, which makes sense if you're estranged from your parents, how you're going to get them to sign your form and give you their tax information. And when they're classified as independent students, they're then eligible for the maximum amount of financial aid.
And which is a wonderful opportunity
to break that cycle of poverty, to get higher education, job training, special skills. And also another opportunity that's wonderful for high school students is to be dual enrolled, either at MTI in one of the technical programs or at State College of Florida. Now, there isn't any tuition, and while they're homeless, most of the fees are waived, but if you start looking at our technical programs, there are uniforms and tools and kits and all kinds of extra fees that can add up to several hundred.
That have to be considered as part of
and lab fees at the college, and just different things that might preclude a homeless student from being able to participate, because like, oh, well, yeah, I can go, I don't have to pay tuition, but I can't afford the kit. I can't afford these welding tools. I can't afford this culinary uniform or these textbooks.
And then you're further behind, and you get a little further behind. And that's why it's so critical to have organizations and churches and also have that funding in place to be able to support this. Now, Deb, unfortunately, we're kind of winding down, but I do want to announce that Deb will be hosting additional programs specifically about homelessness and homeless children throughout this coming year. And she's going to be very in-depth about some of the issues and programs and resources and services that are going to be available. But on this initial program, Deb, I think it's very important for this community, because Manatee County is a very giving community. There's a lot of people out there who are very supportive of a wide variety of concerns. But it would seem to me, and especially coming from you, who is such a dedicated public servant, that being a homeless child is a terrifying perspective. And it really doesn't matter how loving your parents are, whatever the circumstances might be, if at any given time you don't know where you're going to lay your head, you don't know how you're going to get to school, you don't know where your school is. All of these things for a young person weigh heavy on them, and it can be effective. And I do appreciate your comment, is that they get older, these weights become a little bit more and more intense. In our last few minutes, I'd like you to take a couple of moments. What can we do as a community, as a country, to try to help alleviate some of these things, especially for children?
Affordable housing is number one. You can't talk about homelessness without talking about housing. And unfortunately, the second piece of that is the supportive services in the community. And with the economy the way it is, and a lot of the political attitude is to cut, and social services, unfortunately, are being axed left and right. So without an adequate inventory of affordable housing for our very low income, safe, decent, affordable housing, and without community supports for all of those multiple issues that we talked about that can lead into homelessness, the problem isn't going away. You can say, Jesus said always there will be poor among you, but he also said, whatever you do for the least of my brethren you do to me, and would be like unto the children. So the issue is not going to disappear. There will always be poverty, but if we as a society really valued our children as our next generation, we would invest in those things that will help them be successful contributing members of our community. And a lot of individuals and civic groups and church groups do that. But I think it really needs to be part of our national identity that we care for our unfortunate, that we provide opportunities for people to achieve to their best potential. And we can talk about equality. People are not all equal, but we all deserve equal opportunities to be our best selves. So just because someone is limited in some way or has a mental illness or something like that, doesn't mean that they shouldn't have the full opportunity.
From that opportunity.
There will always be poor among us, and there'll always be social stratification, but I would like to see our national identity is that we take pride pride in the fact that we allow our children the greatest opportunity for success by funding education, by funding social welfare programs, by funding foster care and child protective services so we're not losing these children, community mental health, building a supply of adequate affordable housing with recreational activities built in, tutoring, all kinds of programs that you could have on-site in place for those families to help them rise up and become fully participating, self-sustaining members of society. But unfortunately, I don't really see that we're at that place yet, and I don't know when we will. So my work continues, and
you're doing yeoman's work here, and I don't think throughout this community there are several wonderful organizations that do great things with the Community Coalition on Homelessness, and when you mentioned Lee Martin and Della Rose, they're doing wonderful things. But in this community, I don't think that there is a better advocate for homeless children than you. And I think over your career and the time that you've been with the district, the children that have been homeless have been really well served by the efforts and the energy that you put into this. And we welcome you to continue to try to do these programs so the community can continue to find out about what the situation is, what they can do to help, and what are the resources and services that you're continuing to provide. So the next program that we do on homeless children, Deb will be here hosting it with other guests to talk about it. Deb, final comment. What should this community know about children that are homeless in our community?
They don't look homeless. They don't have a sign across their chest that says, I'm homeless. More often than not, they look like any other child. Sometimes you may have issues, kids are dirty or whatever, but more often than not, there's no indication. And like I said, they're not going to say, oh, well, little kids will say, oh, we lost our housing or we're in a motel. Teenagers are not going to tell you.
That's true.
And people don't believe that they're homeless if they're sleeping on somebody else's couch or, oh, I'm in a motel. Yesterday I was at a motel and the woman said, do you help the truly homeless? Because I'm not really homeless. I've got a roof over my head in this motel room. And I'm thinking, it's Christmas. You're living in a motel room. You have no furniture. But she wanted to help somebody she thought was less fortunate than her, a kid who was homeless on the streets. So, there's really they don't walk around with big signs. And it can happen to anybody, anybody. The circumstances sometimes that lead to people being homeless are just tragedies.
And it is. And hopefully we can continue this conversation with other programs to give some insight and some illumination into what the situation of homelessness is. Deb, thank you so much for being on this program. We'll look forward to having you back to host these programs. In Manatee County, 1,100 at the last count that Deb just mentioned. And that number has grown up, and hopefully it will continue to go down. If you want to find out additional information about the situation of homeless children here in Manatee County, go to the manateeschools.net website or contact Deb Bailey to find out how you can help or to find out how you can be a part of solving this concern. Thank you for joining us on this special edition of Up Close on METV.